So let's start with a little story. A stuntman once stretched a tightrope above the Niagara Falls. As a matter of fact, you'll see in a moment that parts of this is a true story. And a crowd gathered as he walked across the falls on the tightrope, and he came back to the same bank. And he turned to the crowd and he said to them, "How many of you believe that I can walk back and forth on this tightrope wearing a blindfold?" And the crowd cheered and cheered and said, "We believe, we believe." So the man made the trip blindfolded, and the crowd went wild, cheering and clapping. And then the man asked the crowd, "How many of you believe I can walk this tightrope blindfolded and pushing a wheelbarrow?" And the crowd yelled even louder, "We believe, we believe." And the man performed this feat as well, and the crowd screamed and cheered louder than ever before. And then the man turned round and he said, "How many of you believe that I can walk this tightrope blindfolded, pushing a wheelbarrow with someone inside?" And the crowd went berserk, yelling and screaming, "We believe, we believe." And the stuntman turned to the largest believer and he said, "Okay, I need you to volunteer." You see, there's a difference between theory and practice. And we've been talking about theory for the last couple of weeks. And tonight we're going to talk about practice. But by the way, just to tell you that this is a legend about an actual 19th century French stuntman called Charles Blondin, who in fact did cross the Niagara Falls on a tightrope multiple times, doing crazy things. But this part of the legend with the wheelbarrow and everything else is unconfirmed, I'm sorry to tell you. Well, over the two previous lessons, we've discussed death and the soul's transition from this world from the perspective of what happens to the soul. As you recall, in the first lesson, we spoke about how the soul is eternal and how its time inhabiting the body is just one phase of its existence. In the second lesson, we spoke about what happens when the soul leaves the body. But today, we're going to talk about death and bereavement from our own human perspective, the practical reality of death and the gaping hole that it leaves in its wake in the hearts of those who are left behind. Now, I'm very conscious of the fact that we may be opening up some old or new wounds. But I hope that the information that we're going to learn in today's lesson is going to ultimately allow us to better cope with the pain and the ache in our hearts that so many of us still continue to feel. We're going to begin today's class with a reading of two people's very different experiences of loss. And so we're going to turn to text number 1 on your pages 84. And just by the way, to mention, there are a number of people who don't have the workbooks with them, and all they're missing is actually the texts, because everything else I'm explaining. But when you do read the texts, please make sure that you read them as clearly as possible. And just again to remind you that you've got two views. Whenever you come back to speaker view, you're going to see these two screens. And if you go back to gallery, you'll see everyone. And then when you come back to speaker view, you'll come back to these two screens again. So let's start with text number 1 on page 84. And if somebody would please read text number 1. And immediately after that, can we have a volunteer to read text number 2? 2 stories. Volunteer, please.
Heather, this is by George A. Bonanno, PhD, apparently, a psychologist. Heather Lindquist was in the kitchen cleaning up after lunch when she heard a dull thud. It sounded as if it came from the hallway, and it was just a little too loud to ignore. "Boys," she yelled, "what are you up to?" There was no answer. She found her 2 boys playing quietly on the couch in the living room. They giggled. "You jokers," she said with a smile. "What was that sound?" They shrugged. "Where is your father?" Without waiting for an answer, she ran toward the hallway. She cried out in fear when she found her husband, John, writhing on the floor. John had severe asthma. He was taking a new medication, and it had seemed to be working, but suddenly he had collapsed in the worst attack he'd ever had. Heather tried everything she could think of to save her husband's life. Then she called an ambulance. The rest was a blur. John died of cardiac arrest on the way to the hospital. Heather was 34 years old. Her boys were 5 and 7. At that moment, John's death felt like the worst thing that could ever have happened to her. Heather Lindquist had lived her entire life in the same quiet suburban community in northern New Jersey. She and John had been high school sweethearts. They married and purchased a small ranch-style house. They had children. They got a dog. The schools were good and the community was stable. Heather thought that the television was on more than it should be, but other than that, everything seemed in order. Then John died and she had to rethink it all. Now she was a single parent. She had to find new ways to earn money and also find extra time to be with her boys. And somehow she had to contain everyone's anguish. She found strength she didn't know she had. It was lonely and painful at times, but Heather found meaning and vigour and even joy in the idea that she was going to make it. I expected to collapse. I really did. That's what I wanted to do. That would have been the easiest thing to do, Heather explained, but I couldn't. Each day I got up and did what I had to do. The days passed and somehow it was okay. The boys were great. They were upset in the beginning, of course we all were. They hung in there and we stayed together. I loved those boys so much. John would have been proud of them.
And our second story is by Fran Schumer from a book called After a Death, The Pain That Doesn't Go Away. It was in the New York Times on September the 28th, 2009. And a reader, please.
In 2004, Stephanie Muldberg of Short Hills, New Jersey, lost her son Eric, 13, to Ewing's sarcoma, a bone cancer. 4 years after Eric's death, Ms. Muldberg, now 48, walked around like a zombie. I felt guilty all the time, guilty about living, she said. I couldn't walk into the deli because Eric couldn't go there any longer. I couldn't play golf because Eric couldn't play golf. My life was a mess. And I couldn't talk to my friends about it because after a while they didn't want to hear about it. Stephanie, you need to get your life back, they'd say. But how could I? On birthdays, I'd shut the door and take the phone off the hook. Eric couldn't have any more birthdays. Why should I?
Okay, so those are our two stories. And the question for us is how we evaluate these two stories. Is Heather, our first story, is she in denial? Maybe not. Of course, the loss was very painful, but she realized that sad as she was, she had children and a life to get back to, and she had to continue to focus on mourning. That to continue to focus on mourning wasn't going to be healthy, or wasn't going to be the right response. The question we have to ask about our second story about Stephanie is she overacting? Or perhaps she didn't see the option of having a different response. She experienced chronic grief and left her absolutely emotionally handicapped. The question is, why do they react differently? There is an easy answer. Heather is more emotionally resilient than Stephanie. And, that could be the case as well. But as you know in life, the easy answer isn't always the correct one. Because just as no two people are alike, there are no two circumstances that are the same. When you dig down a little bit more deeply into these two stories, you realize that there are some massive differences between the circumstances of these two people. Heather's husband died suddenly after a relatively brief period of suffering. She survived by 2 sons. Stephanie's son, on the other hand, has died from an awful form of cancer. As I understand it, this osteosarcoma often involves amputation high above the cancerous bone often at the hip or at the shoulder. And death can be agonizing and drawn out. We don't know from the story whether she had any other family members who were reliant on her. From a psychological perspective, there are very substantive differences between these two women. And therefore that makes comparing the two women's reactions very problematic. Heather had compelling reasons to keep moving, those compelling reasons being her two children. Any parent knows that many people would do for their children, for the sake of their children, things which they wouldn't simply do for themselves. And in addition to that, her husband's death was sudden. There weren't too many bad times before the loss. Heather acknowledged that she had to keep moving for the sake of her sons. And as for Stephanie, we don't know who, beyond her well-meaning friends, she had left in her family life. There's no mention of a husband or other children. If she was a single mother with no other children, her circumstances were very markedly different from the first mother. And as we've already mentioned, the death of a child is just about the worst. And it was likely to have occurred after a long period of extreme suffering and of various treatments. And even if circumstances were the same, different people react to grief differently depending on a whole range of factors, emotional sensitivity, other psychological factors. And therefore, before we can begin to discuss whether there is a better way to mourn and what that way might be, one thing is absolutely clear as our baseline. Human beings respond to and cope with loss in various ways, from resilience on the one hand to prolonged and chronic grief, depression, and sometimes even worse. The loss of a loved one doesn't equal a certain experience. It's always going to vary from person to person and be based upon many factors. And therefore the most important thing for us to understand is never to be judgmental. You can't fault a person or judge a person because of the way in which he or she reacts to grief. Let's take a look at a couple of slides. And that summarizes what we've been saying. That said, what can the person who's experiencing paralyzing grief do to ameliorate that pain and to re-emerge into life? In a nutshell, here's the question that we ask tonight. That's effectively what we want to discuss. So in today's lesson, we're going to see how the Torah guides us through the difficult times that follow the death of a loved one. As a number of the ideas that we'll hear tonight, we have already heard in the last 2 weeks, but the only difference is that, as I mentioned at the outset, we've learned these ideas from the perspective of the soul of the person who's passed away. And today we want to flip that and learn them from the perspective of the bereaved survivors. In other words, us. So the lesson in a nutshell. First, we're going to look at how to view mourning and grief, how one should act following a loss, and how one can be comforted. In the second part of the lesson, we're going to discuss several general Torah principles that can help a person who's in distress to deal with chronic grief. And in the final part, we're going to talk about some of the proper etiquette for friends and family who come to visit someone who is grieving. That's our agenda for the night. Here's the lesson overview in our slides. Okay, shall we continue?
Thank you.
Okay, let's stop for a moment and ask a more basic question. The question is mourning an appropriate ideal? I ask this question both in terms of what we've been learning up until now about the exotic life of the soul after death, going to a, in inverted commas, a better place, and also because, there have been very wise people in other cultures who thought that the answer to this question is no. Socrates, 5th century before the Common Era, he was the philosopher, citizen of Athens and Greece. He, for one, didn't think that death was a very big deal or worthy of mourning of it. There's a fascinating story about him. He had this this habit of challenging received wisdom. It made him very unpopular with the ruling class, and he was eventually put on trial and was found guilty of corrupting the minds of the youth of Athens and of impiety, not believing in the gods of the state. So he was sentenced to death. And shortly before he was put to death, he was visited in prison by several of his disciples. And one of the disciples present was a man called Phaedo, who later related to Plato, who was also a disciple of Socrates, but who wasn't present that day, the dialogue that took place in the prison cell when Socrates spoke to his disciples. And Plato then recorded the conversation, and it appears in his work called Phaedo. So in the course of the conversation, Socrates turns to his disciple Cebes to relay the following message to another one of his disciples, Evenus the poet. And this is our text number 3 on page 87. And a reader, please.
Shall I read?
Please.
Yes. Socrates instructed, Cebes, please relate the following message to Evenus, and bid him be of good cheer. Say that I would have him come after me by immediately leaving this world, if he be a wise man, and not tarry, and that today I am likely to be going, for the Athenians say that I must. Simmias said, what a message for such a man! Having been a frequent companion of his, I should say that as far as I know him, he will never take your advice unless he is obliged. Why, said Socrates, is not Evenus a philosopher? I think that he is, said Simmias. Then he, or any man who has the spirit of philosophy, will be willing to die, but he will not take his own life, for that is held to be unlawful. The day may come when you will understand. Why, though, a man is better dead, he is not permitted to be his own benefactor, but must wait for the hand of another.
So what we hear from the story is that Socrates is not worried about death. In fact, he's recommending it to one of his disciples. It's because the true philosopher is actually one who seeks death, because then you're removed from the shackles of the body. You allow the experience of spirit and truth in its purest form. Hello, where have we heard that before? And the answer is over the last 2 weeks in our own classes. So it's not all that dissimilar at this point to the Jewish view that we've been discussing. And by the way, Socrates is against suicide. That's the last part. You have to wait for somebody else to do it to you. You can't do it yourself. But if you take this perspective, mourning for the dead has absolutely no place, because this world is just a limitation. It's a drag. Death is the ultimate desire for a thinking human being. Tell me if you can see the slides. He is not permitted to be his own benefactor. This is his injunction against death. And we ask the question, what is the Jewish view? Well, you know that Judaism does not agree with this perspective, because mourning the death of a loved one is a very age-old Jewish tradition, and as a matter of fact, it's more than a tradition. It is obligatory. It is considered to be one of the special commandments, a mitzvah. And we've got a one-liner over here in text number 4 on page 88, and because it's just one line, I shall read it. We are biblically commanded to mourn the deaths of our next of kin. And that comes directly from Maimonides in Mishneh Torah. we are biblically commanded to mourn the deaths of our next of kin. The question, however, is why? Why doesn't Judaism agree with Socrates? There are definitely points of agreement about the soul and being set free and all that stuff. But why does Judaism disagree with what seems to be a very logical argument? If you believe that death is not the end, and that the soul is eternal, and that our world, by contrast, is filled with deception, and the next world is so true and so pure, why should we mourn the passing of a person from this world to the next? Perhaps we should celebrate. Remember what we said about the moment when the soul leaves the body. That is the fulfillment of their soul's entire life. It is a moment of freedom for the soul. It's the moment in which it's able to express itself in the fullest sense compared to the limitations of a soul in a body. That was the video that we watched last week. So let's try and find out why it is that we mourn. And we have 3 texts that we're going to look at. 5a, 5b, and 5c. Page 89, text 5a. A reader, please. Man or woman? We've had women tonight. Let's have one of the men.
No, I'll read. Sorry.
Okay.
All right. The Torah does not forbid us to weep in response to a death, because it is human nature to be moved to tears when separating from loved ones and at their journeying away, even if they're alive.
Well, you see, isn't that interesting? God created us in such a way that when somebody dies, we cry. Don't give me any other arguments. Don't start talking to me about theory. Don't give me big theological principles and everything else. When somebody who you loved dies, you cry. And that's human nature. And the God who created us in human nature is not going to command us to do something that goes completely against the way in which we've been created. So even though the soul might still exist and might be very happy in its new unlimited spiritual state, we have physically lost someone who's part of our life and actually part of our very self. And this instinctively must translate into feelings of sadness and pain. And it's axiomatic that God is not going to ask of us something which is humanly impossible. And therefore the Torah, which acknowledges reality, allows mourning. And there's a second point as well, and that's in our text 5b on page 90. Waiting for someone to read.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
Mourners find comfort in crying and in arousing their sorrow until their bodies are too weak to handle the intensity of their internal turmoil, just as happy individuals find contentment in various forms of light-hearted activities.
And this comes from Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexity. What is adding over here is something else. In 5a we said it's natural to cry. Here Maimonides is adding that not only is it natural, but it's actually very helpful because it has a psychological benefit. It's cathartic. Crying was invented because it works. It does good things for us. We need to cry. It actually brings comfort to the bereaved mourner. That's the nature of tears, of sobbing. And one more text over here, which now adds another reason. Text number 5c on page 91. This, by the way, is from a sage called Rabbi David ibn Zimra in one of his responsa. And he's asked a very interesting question. Please, someone read it.
One of this generation's greatest personalities failed to shed a single tear upon losing a son. Is this a praiseworthy reaction?
That's the question that is put to him for a responsa. And he answers,
Such behavior is offensive and objectionable. It demonstrates heartlessness, distasteful character, and cruelty. This is the way of the philosophers who maintain that this world is without purpose.
i.e. Socrates.
By contrast, we who have received the Torah are expected to believe and to realize that this world is of great value for those who properly utilize their time here and behave appropriately. It is through our actions in this world that we merit the world to come. Crying, mourning, and shedding tears over the passing of a relative, and especially for an honorable individual, is the way of the pious, the prophets, and individuals renowned for their good deeds. It is not for naught that our sages instruct us to observe 3 days for weeping, 7 for eulogies, and 30 for restrictions on wearing new clothing and getting haircuts, etc. If weeping were improper, the sages would not have instituted a 3-day weeping period. In fact, the Torah emphasizes that our forefather Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and weep for her, and that Jacob, King David, and countless individuals of similar caliber acted likewise.
Okay, so our first text says that it's natural. Our second text says that it's cathartic. What's added by our third text? Anybody?
But it's an insult to the life that you've lived, that the person's lived, if you don't cry and mourn for that life. But it's a life without purpose.
And also that we understand that the world has purpose. It's not that this world is useless and you just want to get to the next one quick. This one has value.
Yes. In other words, what we've added with this third text is that mourning expresses a Jewish theological truth as well. And that is the reasons why we are permitted to mourn. So Judaism fundamentally disagrees with the philosophy espoused by Socrates. The Torah asserts that God created this world for a reason. As we explained in lesson number 1, the whole purpose of all creation, including the highest spiritual worlds, is for this physical world, because it's in this world that God desires that we connect with him and that we reveal his presence. And because our time in this physical world, as Leslie has just said, is purposeful, when we leave it, it's only natural that we should mourn their departure. So mourning is not only natural and beneficial, from a Jewish perspective it becomes obligatory as well. The formal obligation to mourn, by the way, pertains only to certain members of the family. I'm not sure if everybody knows who those members are. We call them the defining kin. Of course, let me make it clear. You can mourn for everyone, and you can be sad at their loss. But the specific rituals that we're talking about in terms of obligation apply only to the defining kin, and you will see them all in figure 3.1 on page 92. I just missed out a couple of slides over here, which I want to take you through first. The Torah view of mourning, acknowledgement of reality, psychological benefits, that was our 5b, and there is our 5c, the value of physical life. But let's take a very quick look at figure 3.1. And for those who don't have text in front of them, let me tell you that the Torah rules of mourning are limited to the following next of kin: a father and mother, a sibling, a spouse, a son, or a daughter. That's the obligatory ones. And having said that, we're now going to have a look at the process of mourning that is prescribed by the halakha. On page 93 in figure 3.2, we're going to have a key to the Jewish mourning processes. And again, I want to take you through these stages for those who don't have books in front of them. And we'll see this summarized in a few moments in our next slides. But in terms of time period, the first time period is called aninut. And this is the most intense period of mourning. This is immediately the person has passed away. There's no attempt to comfort or console the mourners. During this period, the next of kin are absolved of all the positive mitzvot, obligations to do something such as to pray, etc. Nothing should be allowed to distract the mourner's pain and their full attention to the interment, the arrangements for burial. At some time during this aninot stage, the mourners tear their outer garment as a sign of mourning. We'll come back to that in a moment. That's stage number 1 of mourning. The second stage is the Shiva, the 7-day mourning period, which we're going to look at. The next stage is 30 days, and that is the Shloshim. After getting up from Shiva, resuming the everyday routines of life, there's still certain mourning practices that are continued until 30 days from the time of burial. These include refraining from wearing new clothes, getting a haircut or shaving, participating in festive events. The next stage is 12 months. After the passing of a parent, some of the Shloshim mourning practices, such as not participating in festive events, are continued by the children until 12 months have passed. And it's customary for the mourners, by the way, I think many people will not know this, but I put out the candle for my mum just last Thursday after having kept a candle alight for the entire 12-month period. And then, of course, there is the Yortzeit. So here are, in these slides over here, a very quick summary of these stages. Looking at Aninut first. Here are the laws and traditions of Aninut. No attempt to console the mourners. Absolved from all mitzvot. Immediate family members tear an outer garment. That is until the burial. Then we move on to the Shloshim. 30-day mourning. Avoid new clothes, no haircuts, no festive events. And we move on to 12 months. Mourning commencement, which starts with the burial. The period applies to mourning for parent, not for children or for siblings, which is only 30 days. And some of the Shloshim restrictions continue. And customary to keep a candle burning for the entire 12 months. And then you come to the Yortzeit, the anniversary of the passing, reciting Kaddish, and additional Torah study. Extra good deeds in memory and the merit of the deceased. Those are the stages of mourning. I think most people on this Zoom would be familiar with those stages, but it was useful just to summarize them. But we want to take this a step further now, and having looked at in the first instance at the grief spectrum in those two stories and the mourning process, we need to now look at the way in which we process the pain and the way in which it affects our lives. And the reality is that mourning most times is accompanied by a lot of pain. And I want to say that bereavement is actually very, very deep. Even when you think that you're doing really well, you say, hey, look at me, look how well I'm coping. Aren't I doing well? See how I've managed all of this? Okay, so, I've got through everything else. But actually, there's stuff swirling beneath the surface. And funny things happen. You suddenly find yourself crying over something you've got no idea what it is that sets you off. There's just stuff swirling around at the subconscious level. And, I always advise people that for 12 months after the death of someone who was very dear to you, for whom you are mourning, don't make any major life decisions. Because people do the most extraordinarily silly things in those 12 months, thinking that they're in complete and total control, and they don't realize just how deep bereavement is. And bereavement really affects our behaviors for a long time. And what we want to look at now is the way in which it affects us. And I want to start with a little bit of historical background to deal with this section. So up until the 1980s, all the psychological studies of grief and coping with the loss of a loved one focused on two separate, different areas. There were two schools of thought. One school of thought, one area focused on the grieving person's functionality. How are they doing? The kind of stuff I was talking about a moment ago. How are they doing? How are they managing, in their lives as a measure of how well they're coping? Is the grieving person managing at work? Are they managing relationships with families and friends? Do they care about the other areas of their lives, etc.? All the functional part of our lives. And the second area of study, the second school, looked at the bereaved person's separation from the person who died as the biggest and the most important factor in grief. It focused on the relationship and the emotional impact of the loss of that relationship. So the relationship with and separation from the person who died was the key to understanding how this person was, in inverted commas, managing their grief. And then an Israeli doctor, Dr. Simon Shimshon Rubin, who was a professor of clinical psychology who specialized in the study of loss and bereavement and human resilience at the University of Haifa, as it happens, and he had spent a number of years studying grief. And he came to the conclusion that the understanding of how people deal with bereavement actually must join both of these strands. And so in 1981, he produced a major paper which he called the two-track model of bereavement. Now, in your workbooks, there is quite a big chart in figure number 3.3 on page 94. And I'm not proposing to go through all of this now, especially as there are some who don't have this chart in front of them. But you see that there's track one and all the kinds of behaviors that are affected in terms of functionality above the upper half of the page. And track two, the relationship with the deceased, and all the sorts of things that entailed in the bottom half of the page. And it's actually very comprehensive. And you look through all of these items over here, and you realize, of course, that in some way or another we've all experienced some of these. But his big contribution was that the two tracks needed to be joined together. And I'll leave you to study this very fascinating chart in your own time. But for those particularly who don't have the book in front of you, here is an aide-memoire in our next few slides. There's function and relationship, the two tracks. Function is engagement at work, maintaining relationships and other interests. Relationship would be the connection with the deceased, separation from the deceased. Those are the main factors. And in 2014, the same Dr. Rubin published an article, he was quite an observant man, in which he notices that some of the traditional Jewish mourning rituals actually address both sides of this psychological model. And in this article, it points out how the various rituals that Judaism have invented over the course of the centuries actually touch all of these points on both sides of these two tracks. And how all of these rituals that we have help the mourner to ease back into, on the one hand, normal functioning, as well as rituals that consider the internal feelings and the evolving relationship with the loved one that they lost. And that's the last point over here. On this slide, the Jewish mourning process addresses both of these perspectives. On page 96, in figure 3.4, that's the one that you see here, a little chart that shows you how in these stages of mourning that we discussed, Aninut, Shiva, Shloshim, 12 months, and Yortzeit, the practices that we have on one side, functional, and on the other side, relational, actually applies. So again, for the sake of those who don't have the chart in front of them, when you look at aninut from the point of view of function, there's only a minimal function that is expected of a person. When you are in this dazed state of immediate death, your functionality simply shuts down. And that's what Judaism expects to happen. And on the other side of the track, during this period of time, all of one's actions are aimed at furthering the respect and the honor of the deceased. You are preparing for the burial of the person who you loved. And when you move to Shiva, if you look at track number 1, relation in terms of functionality, there's a limited function. Duties and most usual duties and routines are suspended during this period of time. And despite continuous awareness of the loss, there is nevertheless an element of routine and function, because you have all these people coming into the house and talking to you, and you have to talk back to them, and you have to function. So all of the preparing of food and the running of a house, all of that disappears. You don't go to work, all that functionality is cut out, but you've moved beyond aninut, and you actually have to start relating to people, functioning. On the other side of this, in terms of the relationship with the person who's passed away, you share memories of the person who's passed away, the people who come to visit you. And this deepens your sense of awareness of your loss. And there are all kinds of religious rituals that are required to provide merit for the deceased in the next world, the Kaddish and the davening, and etc., etc. When you move on to Shloshim and you look at function, now all of the outside responsibilities have resumed, with the exception of several requirements designed to mark one's mourning. So you're not going to theatres and cinemas and music and dances and smachot and everything else. So your functionality is still a little bit limited, but much more expansive. You're back into normal life. On the other side of the track, in terms of relationships, less time is being allocated to the focus of the loss, but the griever continues to contemplate the loss, engages in numerous religious activities, the recitation of Kaddish, etc. And as you move to 12 months, you see that there is progressive functionality, and the relationship is now becoming slightly more normalized until you come to the Yortzeit, where there is continued awareness of the loss, but the function of your life has come back to pretty much normal. And in terms of the relationship, it's a special day to mark the 12 months. Actions, prayers, space in the calendar is provided for strengthening the bond and the relationship and the continuing process. So here you see in his concept the way in which these two tracks are reflected in our stages of mourning that we outlined.
Sorry, can I ask something? So,
Please.
Did you say that Simon Shimshon was observant or not?
Yes. When you take a look at the story, the picture of him somewhere, I think, well, you don't have a picture. I think I might have a picture. I think he was an observant Jew, I believe. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. All right. So here's a bit of some slides which simply pick up on these ideas. Oh, well, sorry, we're not there yet. We're going to come back to that. Okay. There are two fundamental stages in grieving. The first and most important is acceptance. And the second is processing. So Judaism has two rituals, one for each of these stages. For acceptance, we have this thing called kriya, ripping or tearing. And for processing, we have Shiva, the 7 days. We're going to look at these two, and we're going to start with acceptance, the first stage of mourning, when reality strikes, or when it doesn't strike and you have to do something to help it to strike. So a really important element of the laws of mourning is the acceptance of this new and very painful reality. You can't begin to heal until you've really accepted the full implications of the loss. And Judaism devised this concept of tearing the garment, ripping the garment, as a way to help us with this transition of acceptance. Interestingly, by the way, in the Torah, there are several mentions of people tearing their garments as a symbol of grief and mourning. And the very first one was when Jacob's sons came back to him and deceived him into believing that Joseph was dead. This is text number 6 on page 97.
Brothers slaughtered a goat and dipped Joseph's tunic in its blood. They sent the coloured tunic home, and the couriers brought it to their father and said, "We have found this. Please identify whether or not it is your son's tunic." Jacob recognized it and exclaimed, "It's my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has been torn to pieces." Jacob rent his garments, placed sackcloth on his loins, and mourned his son for many days.
There we are. He rent his garments. That's the first mention we have in the Torah of renting garments. But we're going to see from this next reading now that the act of tearing one's garment is more than just a symbol of grief and mourning. This is text number 7 on page 98. It's taken from Rabbi Yehuda Ayash in a responsa that he gave. Perhaps somebody who hasn't read yet? Shall I pick someone? Caroline Esdale, I see your name up here. Why don't you read it for us?
Rabbi Yaakov Hagiz states in
Halachot Ketanot,
chapter 116, that mourners are instructed to rent their garments as a method of distracting from and reducing their overwhelming grief. In my humble opinion, the opposite is true. Having to rend their garments brings mourners to tears and amplifies their pain. The goal is to actively encourage mourners to express their pain over the passing and to experience their tremendous loss.
So you see, he is disagreeing with the opinion of somebody else, Rabbi Yaakov Hagiz, whose view is that the purpose of the rending is to distract a person. And he says, no, you've misunderstood that entirely. The purpose is not to distract them. On the contrary, the whole goal of tearing the garment is to actively encourage the mourners to express their pain over the passing, to experience the tremendous loss. In other words, the visceral act of a ripping or tearing is an expression of the unbearable pain that one feels. And it triggers the onset of the mourning process for people who, until they've heard that ripping sound, are just too numb to feel, or perhaps even those who are too apathetic to feel the need to mourn. So he says it actually does something. It is a shock to the system. You tear your clothes, you rip it, you take your hands, and it's visceral. You tear your and as you tear it, he says this is the process that forces you to accept the reality of what has happened. That is the idea, he says, of the Kriya. By the way, strictly speaking, and we saw this in one of the charts, the proper time, halachically, to tear a garment should be immediately after one learns of the passing of one's loved one, if you were with them, or if you hear about it, if you weren't with them. What the Shulchan Aruch describes as sha'at chamimut, when your heart is warm, when you're worked up. In practice, we don't do that, by the way. In this country, the tearing is done in the hall prior to, and is done privately before everybody comes into the hall, when the families stand around the coffin. And the officiating rabbi and the sexton are normally there to help the family, to give them the scissors and to recite the little lines that are recited, Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, blessed be the God of the true judge, etc. And in some places, in other countries, it's publicly done in front of everyone, which can be very powerful as an expression of pain and sorrow. But wherever it's done, it's about coming to terms with the loss. That's its main purpose. And then after that has happened, the next stage is processing. And that, of course, is not done in one rip. That takes time. Getting back to normal prematurely, by the way, even if you think that you're ready to resume the routines of life, actually inhibits the mourning process, and it doesn't allow the space for grieving and the space in which healing can take place. So it's really important that there is time. Time to mourn and to grieve is absolutely critical in the healing process. And if you don't do this, there's always the danger that it's going to lead to passivity, isolation, depression. If you don't mourn properly at the time when you're supposed to mourn, because you've pushed it away, or because you're not ready for it, or because you're too numb, or whatever it is, then let me assure you that at some time in the future, failure to mourn adequately is going to come back to bite. That is the reality. So we're very, very careful that we expect and want people to mourn in an appropriate way, given the fact that, of course, everybody mourns slightly differently. And that's why we have Shiva. That's why we have 7 days of mourning. And that's why the laws of Avelut, of mourning, mandate increased mourning for the first 3 days. 3 days of weeping, we described it, and provides milestones that compel the mourner to move from one stage to the next. It insists on taking you through the stages, and you can't skip any of the stages. You have to go through it. Sometimes it's like walking through treacle, but it's really necessary. It has to be done.
Shlomo?
Yes.
I totally get where you're coming from. I think the challenge that people have is that we're listening to this now, and we've all probably got experiences of past mornings. We don't know this. For those that don't know this, you just don't get that quick lesson when somebody goes, and you might not be as spiritually connected because whether they haven't listened to you or they haven't read, all of that often sadly comes afterwards when, as you say, it can be too late for some because they haven't embraced it in the way that you're saying. You embrace it because those are your strong beliefs. I'm not saying they're not mine or everybody else's, but when something happens like that, if you don't have that knowledge, that understanding to rip the way you said and to do all of those things and accept, how do people manage if they don't have this insight?
Thank you, Ruthie. But first of all, let me say, isn't it funny how in life you always have to learn on the job? Nobody ever teaches you how to be a parent.
No.
Yeah. you learn, and with everything which happens to us at every stage, you find yourself learning on the job. It's not as if you've been there before. It's always the first time. And the real answer is that in a sensitive environment and in a community, this is the job of the rabbinic couple, to actually guide the mourner through, to help help them with the process, to explain what's going on, etc. And in a sensitive Shiva, one would, and we've not been all that good in South Hampstead into providing materials for people to read that are accessible, etc. But you'd want to be able to provide people with some reading materials that's easily accessible. They can sit down and they can read through it, because these ideas and these laws are not, they're not big Talmudic concepts. They're very real. They're ones which we intuitively grasp because they just make sense. They seem to. I think I always remember my sister who's with us on this Zoom call here, my older sister. When my father died and we sat Shiva, I remember her saying to me, my sister Lydia, she said, as we came out of the week of Shiva, she said, the sages really got it right. In this respect, they really got it right. They understood what's happening inside of us. And it's in that respect, it's intuitive. So with a little bit of help, yes, and sometimes we don't provide enough help.
Shlomo,
yes.
We don't have 3 days of weeping. We bury quickly and then immediately we bury.
No, the 3 days are the first 3 days of Shiva. The first.
It's not 3 days and 7 days. The 3 days is still.
It's within the 7. The first 3 days of the Shiva are the most intense. It's still very fresh, and there's even a suggestion that people should wait first 3 days before you visit the Shiva house because of the intensity of the morning. Yeah.
And sorry, just one last. Well, I could talk all night, but I won't. So I just fortuitously I joined Barry Tucker's Shiva tonight.
Yes.
Literally before I came on here.
Yes.
And Shirley obviously died. Well, not obviously died on the Thursday, which I didn't realise, because we only saw the bereavement notice today. So there's maybe. I was curious as to tonight is the first night of Shiva, and respectfully I thought, well,
no, tonight is the only night of the Zoom Shiva, but they've been sitting Shiva from the day that she died.
Right. So
yeah.
I say the Zoom Shiva. So as a family, absolutely. And what I was thinking is they've had their time together. On
yes,
their own,
indeed.
Large family.
Indeed.
And this is all respectful. I'm not saying anything out of turn. And it made me think before I came on this. Well, they've had their respective time. There's no right or wrong, but here we are, we join later. But they've had their time together, which was obviously very important for them. Listening to you talking about those 3 days of tears and crying, and
Okay, we need to move on because we need to finish in good time. I think everybody realizes, from any of you who've ever sat Shiva, that the most difficult day of Shiva is the day after it's ended. Because then, Estelle, yes, Estelle, would you mind just muting yourself, please? Because we're getting some interference. Thank you. Because the day after Shiva, you have to come out of your little comfortable bubble, the one that's held you and embraced you for the whole week, and you have to begin to face the new reality of life without the person who you loved. And we've seen from these various stages that the Jewish way of mourning is designed to introduce a gradual but a progressive emergence into normal society and function. And at every step of the way, the mourner needs to focus their energies on processing where they are and then moving on to the next reduced stage of mourning. But whichever way it is, we are not intended to remain in the state of mourning forever. And there is a very powerful Talmudic text, which we'll read in text number 8 on page 99.
Shall I read it?
Please.
Neither cry for the dead, nor bemoan him. Neither cry for the dead more than necessary, nor bemoan him more than what is prescribed. How are we expected to act? 3 days for weeping, 7 days for eulogies, and 30 days for restrictions on new clothing and haircuts. Once these have elapsed, God declares, You are not more compassionate than I.
My goodness me. That last line is something else. You are not more compassionate than I, says God. And this is what I've mandated. This is human nature. I'm, I think, a little bit behind in some of my slides. So we're just going to take a look at some of the psychological benefits of tearing garments and of Shiva, the two stages. That's acceptance and process. Tearing the garments is acceptance. Shiva is processing. And here is our statement. You are not more compassionate than I, taken from the Talmud. So we see from this text that while the Torah compassionately validates and encourages mourning, it is also very insistent that when the proper time comes, we need to move on with normal life. And while there's no question that everyone mourns differently, and for some 3 days of weeping will simply not be enough, and others will simply not feel ready to re-emerge into the world at the conclusion of the Shiva and so forth, and for everyone, the pain of losing somebody who you loved never really disappears. By the way, for anyone who's ever lost a friend, can I recommend that you read an Appendix A. It's on page 115, a most beautiful article which was posted on the internet by someone who had lost a dear friend, and it's called The Waves of Grief. It's really worthwhile reading. Please do take a look at that in due course. Nevertheless, the principle remains that the extraordinary and extended mourning is not what God wants from us. If our feelings have not fully caught up to where we are in the mourning timeline, we need to focus our energies on moving to the next stage, and our actions our actions influence our feelings as well. So we need to act and move on. But the question is, how? Easily said than done. Where do we find comfort? How do you move on? And as you know, to a very large extent, this is an internal process. It's something that the mourners have to do for him or herself. But words of consolation from friends can make a very big difference. So let's just pause here for a moment, and based on the sorts of things we've learned in this course so far, what are the kinds of concepts that might serve as consolation to a person who's mourning? What could we be saying to them as friends that might give them comfort? Does anybody have any suggestions?
To maybe, to maybe talk about the person who has died and talk about memories that, of bygone days, etc.
Well, that's really excellent. We're going to come back a little bit later towards the end of tonight on some of the etiquette, the do's and don'ts of a shiva, and that will certainly come into play. I was thinking more along, we've learnt about, does it make a difference if you talk to a person about how the soul is eternal, or the fact that a relationship with a person can continue even after they've died, that the soul is enjoying a relationship with God, and any of those things. But actually, we have one very special thing. We have a custom in this country, of course, to wish a mourner, to say to a mourner, I wish you a long life. In America, they say, I'm sorry for your loss. And both are very nice sentiments. But actually, they're not the ones that Judaism instituted, at least not for Ashkenazim. Because there is a custom in Ashkenazic communities, before departing from the house of a mourner, to say a special text. And you'll see it in text number 9a on page 161. and it's very easy, so I'll read it for you myself. And it reads as follows: Hamakom yinachem etchem betoch sha'ar avelei Zion v'Yerushalayim. May the omnipresent God console you along with the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. Now, it's true, by the way, that most people don't say this in this country, either because they can't read the Hebrew, or because they can't remember the phrase, or because they can remember it, but they get tongue-tied trying to say it when you're standing in front of a mourner. So, in the end, we simply escape with, I wish you a long life. Since you do insist on jokes, I'll tell you about this extraordinary new battery factory that was built and needed to have no single human being in it. Was completely and totally automated. And somebody was brought round to, a minister of government was brought round to inspect this incredible factory, completely automated. And they went through every stage of it, producing these amazing numbers of batteries, on this production line from start to finish, etc. And they come to this last vast hall, and the batteries are moving down the conveyor belt, to the end to be packed up. And he sees in the distance, right at the end of this hall, a little black figure sort of moving backwards and forwards, sort of doing something like this. And he says, I thought you told me, to the manager of the operation, I thought you told me there's no human intervention. He said, no. He says, this is a little bit different. He says, that's the local rabbi. So, well, why on earth do you have a rabbi in a battery factory? He says, well, come and listen to what he's saying. And they walk up to the rabbi, and the rabbi's standing there, and as every battery comes past, he says, I wish you a long life. I wish you a long life. I wish you a long life. That's what we say in this country. I wish you a long life. But the proper blessing of consolation is the one in text number 9a.
Can I ask something, Rabbi Shlomo?
Yes.
It's true, isn't it? We're not supposed to greet the mourner or say goodbye.
We're coming to that. Hold your horses, okay? So there are a couple of points about this little statement. The first one is, why should we wish that God should console them? May the omnipresent God console you amongst the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. Why don't you say, I would like you to console you, or may you be consoled, or something different? Why all of a sudden you're bringing God into the story? And I suppose one of the messages is that ultimately the ability to find comfort has to come from one's relationship with God. That there's nothing that you or I can ever possibly say to another human being that's going to be enough in its entirety to provide them with comfort. I don't know what finding consolation from God actually means, to tell you the truth. And when I read the suggestion in the leader's notes, I confess to having a problem with it. Because how does God console you? Nice idea. God's going to console you. Consolation will come from God. What happens? Do you get a telegram in the middle of the night from God saying, I console you? How does it happen? And I think that what it means is, yes.
Maybe he's there when nobody else is there. Maybe that's who you speak to in the dark, or.
That's a lovely idea. Thank you for that. That's a beautiful idea. You know that lovely story of the man who, on his deathbed, looked back at his life, and he saw himself walking on a beach, and he saw two sets of footsteps, his and God's alongside him. And then as he looked back at his life, he saw moments of great difficulty, the hardest moments of his life. And when he looked at those moments, he saw that the second set of footsteps had disappeared. And he turned in his dream to God, and he said to him, or he says, turns to God in his agony as he's in these last moments. He says, God, why did you abandon me when I needed you most? And God says to him, silly man, during those hard times, I didn't abandon you. The reason why there's only one set of footsteps is because at those moments I carried you. So I think, Florence, you've said something very beautiful. But I'd like to suggest another thought over here. I don't think that you can fully be consoled until you have made your peace with God. We're going to look at this in a few moments, but until you stop blaming him for what's happened, or until you actually accept that this had to happen, or that you've reached a point of acceptance, about this tragedy, about this loss. And I think that's what it means when you say that God consoles a person. It's about coming to terms at a kind of like transcendent level with the loss. And maybe the consolation from God is just something which has to happen over a period of time. Maybe it doesn't happen in a big argument with God, or a big resolution in a kind of like internal discussion, whatever. But just with the passage of time, we stop crying. We never stop mourning. We don't feel it quite in the same way. It's hard to cry a year or 2 years on. You can't cry the way you cried for the first 3 days. Maybe that's the gift that God gives us. Maybe he just gives us the gift of blocking feelings, or having feelings which can't express themselves in the same way as they did at the moment of urgency. And the second thing that's problematic about this phrase is why all of a sudden we start to introduce Zion and Jerusalem, for goodness sake. The mourning of our nation over the destruction of Zion and Jerusalem is completely removed from the person's personal experience of losing a loved one. And you stand up there and say, may you be, consoled amongst all the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. Do me a favor, leave Zion and Jerusalem out of the story. I'm worried about what's happened to me. What I care about Zion and Jerusalem. And everybody else has mourned over thousands of years. What's my problem right now? What consolation can these words offer to the mourner? Our text 9b on page 101 provides some of the answer to this. This is from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. My goodness me, I didn't realize the time has passed so quickly. Do you still have patience to listen, or have you had enough?
No, carry on.
Okay.
Carry on.
Let's do.
Larry? In
Please.
regard to Zion and Jerusalem, the Romans, and before them the Babylonians, were given dominion only over the wood and stone, silver and gold of the temple's physical manifestation, but not over its inner spiritual essence, contained within the heart of each and every Jew. Over this the nations have no dominion, and it stands eternally. So too, regarding the mourning of the individual, death dominates only the physical body and concerns the deceased person. The soul, however, is eternal. It has merely ascended to the world of truth.
So therefore the mention of mourners of Zion Jerusalem is going to draw parallel and alludes to this comforting thought that we mourn the physical destruction of Jerusalem, but we are comforted by the thought of its spiritual indestructibility. And similarly, with regard to every individual who dies, we mourn their physical absence while simultaneously drawing consolation from the knowledge that their souls continued in an immortal existence. Just to summarize this over here in our next slides. Hamok Minachem. There's the parallel. I am actually going to skip our meditation tonight because I didn't particularly like it on this occasion. But there is a meditation as we had last week, and instead I'm going to skip to the next slide. The body is a garment and the soul never dies. Right, how are we going to help the person who gets stuck? Because not everybody can move forward. What happens if you get stuck and you can't move forward? Stephanie got stuck. Pardon? Again?
Sorry, I didn't realise it's a rhetorical question.
No, it's all right.
Engage in life.
Okay. Well, Stephanie got stuck. She couldn't see a way to move on and continue her life. Okay, we're not going to judge these people, but what are we going to do? How to help a person who is stuck? By the way.
Call them for a start.
Pardon?
You need to contact them and visit them and ask them if they want to meet you. And just let them know that you're there.
Okay, very good. And by the way, whatever we're going to say tonight should not exclude seeking professional help when it's needed. We're just exploring Torah perspectives that can help with healing. But I want to say that people get stuck actually for a number of different reasons. Here are some of them. And we're going to discuss two of them tonight. Two of the most common reasons why people get stuck. And they are these two. Guilt and anger. Okay? Let's start with anger and injustice. One of the common feelings experienced by people who are mourning the passing of a loved one is the sense of injustice. Why did he or she have to die? It's so wrong, it's completely unfair. And by the way, these feelings are hugely amplified when the person is killed by another person as an act of negligence or recklessness or malice.
Agree.
Yeah. And it's one thing when a 95-year-old parent dies peacefully in his or her sleep or has an easy passing. We can accept that. Mourn, yes. Cry, yes. But accept it. There's no anger. But if a 20-year-old young person dies of, say, leukemia, so it's going to raise all kinds of questions. Why did he or she deserve it? What did they do to deserve it? Why do they have to die so young? Why do I deserve this? Why does it happen to me? It all feels so wrong. It's not the way it's supposed to be. I feel wrong and cheated. There's a fascinating text over here. It's quite a long one, but it's worth our reading. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was with a towering figure after the destruction of the Second Temple, who spearheaded the nation's transition from a temple-less reality that followed the destruction. And he had seen firsthand terrible murder, the sale into slavery of millions of Jews by the brutal Roman conquerors. And yet when his own son dies, he finds himself completely and totally disconsolate. Now, he's got thousands of students, but as mentioned in the Ethics of Our Fathers, he's got 5 exceptional students. Each of them were outstanding sages and leaders in their own right. And each one comes to try and comfort their teacher. And this is text number 11 on page 104. I'm going to read it for you, if you don't mind. When the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai passed away, his students arrived to console him. Rabbi Eliezer entered and said before him, "Master," he said, "would you like me to share a thought?" He says, "Yes, speak, please." Rabbi Eliezer says, "Adam had a son who died, and he allowed himself to be consoled. How do we know that?" He quotes a verse, "Adam was intimate with his wife again, and so you should allow yourself to be consoled." Rabbi Yochanan turns around to him and says, it's bad enough that I'm grieving my own loss. You have to make me feel pained for Adam as well? Rabbi Yeshua enters. "Would you like me to share a thought?" "Speak." Rabbi Yeshua says Job had sons and daughters, and they all died in a single day, and yet he allowed himself to be consoled. So you should also accept consolation. And he quotes in the verse in which we see there is consoled. Rabbi Yochanan turns around him and says, it's bad enough that I'm grieving my own loss. You want me to feel pained for Job as well? Next one, Rabbi Yosai enters, says the same thing. Speak. Aaron had 2 illustrious sons. They both died in a single day, and yet he allowed himself to be consoled. V'yidom Aaron kept silent, which implied that he accepted the consolation. Won't you allow yourself to be consoled? Do me a favor. You come with the same shtick. It's bad enough that I'm grieving my loss. I should feel pained for Aaron as well, for his loss. Rabbi Shimon answers, and he quotes King David, who's got the same problem. Eventually, Rabbi Elazar ben Arach enters. When Rabbi Yochanan saw him, he told his attendant, grab a set of clothing for me and be prepared to follow me to the bathhouse, because Rabbi Elazar is a great person, and I'll not be able to hold out in the face of his comforting words. Rabbi Elazar enters, sits before Rabbi Yochanan, and he says to him, let me tell you a parable. Your situation is similar to that of an individual to whom the king entrusted an article for safekeeping. Each day the man would weep and wail in fear, woe is me, when will I emerge unharmed from this safekeeping role? You, master, had a son. He was fluent in the Torah, in the prophets, in the scriptures, in the Mishnah, in the Halakha, in the exegetical teachings, and he passed from this world without a sin. You should certainly accept consolation because you have returned your deposit in perfect condition. Rabbi Yochanan responded, Rabbi Elazar, my son, you have comforted me in a most humane fashion. And to very quickly unpack the story over here as to why Rabbi Yochanan failed to find comfort in the words of his 4 earlier students and was consoled by Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, because Rabbi Yochanan's message to the first students was, everyone is different, and the fact that somebody else was able to find comfort doesn't prove that I can be consoled. They were different, I'm different, and all you've done is you've pained me for their suffering. So the message is, from the 4 failed attempts, don't ever expect one person to behave or react like another. The heart can't receive commands. It can't be instructed to feel a certain way just because it's been proven by somebody else. It has to be engaged, it has to be taught compassionately. What did Rabbi Elazar say? He said life is a deposit. If life is a deposit, then it's not ours, it belongs to God. Everything which we have, our talents, our opportunities, which all of our accomplishments, all of that belongs to the Almighty. We start with 0. And one day, in 120 years, you return it back to God. And if we see our lives as something which doesn't belong to us, something which we inherently deserve, that we are entitled to, if you see your life in that way, then you're cheated and robbed by death of something which was rightfully belonged to you. And therefore you're going to feel feelings of anger and injustice because we compare what we could have been against what we think or what should have been against what others have been given. But if our lives are just a deposit from God, one's whole perspective is going to change. What we are given and what we require to, we're given what we are what we require to accomplish our purpose in life. And Rabbi Elazar's second point was that this young man who died was very fulfilled. He did what he needed to do in this world. And that's almost an extension of the first point. Yes, life as a deposit is given for us for the exact amount of time necessary to fulfill that for which we came into the world to do. And when we die, we have fulfilled our purpose. Just because life is short doesn't mean that its purpose has not been fulfilled, or the purpose of our unique souls in this world. This is the summary, I suppose, of these. You've returned your deposit in perfect condition. Okay. We're going to come back to this one in a moment. Okay. Let's talk very quickly about guilt. There's nothing worse when a person dies than to have leftover baggage that was never attended to. It's really, really hard. If only I'd been better to him or to her. I should have visited more often. I should have called more often. It can gnaw at the conscience of a person who's bereaved. Especially if you feel in some way or another that you've contributed to that person's death by some kind of negligence in some way or another. Or God forbid, if, imagine you gave your car keys to a teenager to drive your car and they had a crash and they, God forbid, died or something like that. The guilt is absolutely unbelievable. You carry it all the time. The way to deal with guilt is by recognizing the really important point that actually death does not terminate the relationship and things can still be fixed even after the person has died. It just changes the form of the relationship from a physical one to a spiritual one, as I've said so many times. And there are ways in which we can compensate for the things which we're unable to do in our lifetimes. Kaddish, Yizkor, etc. Rabbi Arlen of Karlin put it absolutely beautiful. It's on text number 12 on page 176. I read it to you and we'll show you this little slide. He says as follows. When children say Kaddish for their parents, it's like sending them regards. When they learn a chapter of Mishnah on their behalf, it's like sending them a letter. And when they fulfill good deeds for the benefit of their souls, it's like sending them an entire parcel. Isn't that beautiful? That's what we see in these. Here we are. There's the regards, the letter, and the parcel. So you can't give anything physical to a person who's died, but you can still give them spiritual gifts. For example, when a parent who's passed away sees his or her children getting along and treating each other with love and respect, doesn't that bring tremendous nachat and joy to the soul? Is there anything that gives greater pleasure to the soul than seeing the ones you've left behind leading ethical lives, leading lives as decent, good human beings and Jews? So knowing that you can stay in a relationship with someone you loved, to know they continue to feel and to care, can make a difference to a person who feels guilt. Okay. I want very, very quickly to end tonight by talking a little bit about the Shiva House. By the way, there's a video. Again, I really didn't like tonight's video. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip it. Instead, I wanted to finish tonight by talking about Shiva. Maimonides tells us in one of the texts that visiting people in a Shiva house is not a biblical command, it's a rabbinic command, but it is part of love your fellow as yourself. And it's a beautiful thing to be doing. What people don't always realize is that there's a certain etiquette in conduct at a Shiva house. And while most of us have been to Shiva houses, not all of us are aware of some of the etiquette, and insofar as all of us are likely at some point or another to have to visit a Shiva house, it's really useful to know what the etiquette is. So the first piece of etiquette was already alluded to, I think, by Esther. It's called silence. We are not permitted to start a conversation with the mourner. We have to wait for them to open conversation to us. What is the deed of kindness that has no limit? And the answer is the reward is in the silence. I once visited a Shiva in Golders Green. A young man who was a school friend of one of our sons, had lost his father at a very young age. They were a religious family, and the young man himself has now grown to be a great scholar. And I walked into this room, and there must have been possibly 30 people sitting in the room. And there was complete and total silence because this young man didn't want to speak. So we sat there in silence. I sat there for half an hour in complete silence, and then got up and offered him the blessing of consolation and left. And if that's the space that the mourner wants, then that's the space that we have to respect. Because the first principle of comforting the bereaved is simply being there. Our presence is comforting. Just the knowledge that there are friends who care about them, are always there for them, in good times and bad, that in itself is a consolation. So when you walk into a Shiva house, just sit down and be silent until somebody decides to speak to you. And here are some more inappropriate things to do. Here's the list of things not to do in a Shiva house. Okay? Number 1, don't try to lighten the mood. Have you ever walked into a Shiva house and felt that the whole atmosphere is inappropriate, feels like a party? Everybody's telling jokes, one thing or another. Everybody's trying to make a light mood, discussing sports, the latest news headlines, etc., taking the mourner's mind off the problem. It's not a party. The point of Shiva is not to avoid the pain, but to process it. If the mourner wants to laugh or joke or participate in the conversation, that's fine, but you're not furthering the healing process by assuaging the pain. Don't philosophize is rule number 2. The purpose of visiting mourners is to comfort them, not to teach them. There's an appropriate time to discuss the philosophic response to death, but it's not now. There are a number of no phrases to be avoided at all costs. So where were you when he died? Did he die from the cancer or from the chemo? Did you know in advance, or was it sudden? Did he have life insurance? God only takes the good ones. And don't begin any statement with that at least. Respect the pain. Don't diminish it. And don't begin with statements like, what you need to do, or don't compare losses. At least you had a husband for 40 years. My husband died after only 20 years of marriage. And don't discuss the cause of death. And certainly not whether you could have prevented it. Because the cause of death is absolutely irrelevant in the light of one single simple fact. The person who this mourner loved is gone. So, as suggested before, here are the do's. Discuss the person who died and his or her legacy. because a key element of Shiva is discussing the life and the positive qualities and the achievements of the departed person, because it allows the mourner to focus on their loss. It directs them from grief, from passive depression into active mourning. And it shifts the focus to the gift of life that was, rather than on its absence and cessation. And because in discussing the life of the departed and drawing inspiration from his or her good deeds perpetuates the mourner's relationship with the soul of the departed beyond the barrier of death. And this discussion is not just beneficial for the bereaved, but for the soul of the deceased as well. Here are just some slides that summarize our do's and don'ts. These are the don'ts. Okay? And these are the do's. Once again, on the Midrash on page 112, text number 16, our last text for tonight, sums it up. It's on page 112, as I mentioned. And the Midrash says to us as follows. The final word regarding a person is that of the people proclaiming his deeds and commenting, so-and-so was upright, so-and-so was God-fearing. When a person departs the world, God says to the ministering angels, see what people are saying about him. If they say he had been upright and God-fearing, his soul immediately ascends to paradise. That's what we do in Shiva. There is a summary video, but once again, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip it. There's an exercise on page 113, exercise 3.1, that invites you to record your notes and the insights that resonate with you from all that we have learned. But I want to tell you what we're going to talk about next week, and then I just want to very quickly say something about tonight's session. So next week we're going to move to a topic that some people find fascinating, others find it reassuring, and others find it absolutely downright scary. I'm talking about heaven and hell. Does Judaism believe in these concepts? What do we believe about where souls go to? And we're also going to study, as one or two people have asked, for the function and the recitation of saying Kaddish. That's all for next week. But to conclude for tonight, what I want to say is, over the last 3 sessions, we've done a lot of talking, learned about a lot of very big concepts about how the soul has a life of its own, what happens to it as it departs from the body at the moment of death, the stages that it goes through. Tonight we've mirrored that with our own process of grieving, etc. I have a feeling that while all of this stuff is really, useful and helpful, the reality is that the person that we loved is not there, just not there anymore. And you can talk as much as you want about how we have to transition from a physical relationship into a spiritual relationship, and how we have to now refocus the way in which we connect with the person, and that we can continue to connect and have a relationship and all the stuff we've spoken about. I'm not sure that we're all on that kind of level where we can actually manage that in reality. We're just human. And we suffer deeply from loss, and it takes a long, long, long time before we can heal. And a lot of the stuff we've spoken about are things which we need to practice, work at. But we also have to be realistic about who we are and where we're up to in our lives, and the sense of emptiness we feel from simply not being able to give that person a hug or a kiss, or spend time with them, or a friendship, or sit at the pool with them, or spend time with them in their flat or in their home or wherever we were with them, etc. All of that is just missing. And that's a reality. And I think one of the really important things which comes out of tonight's lesson is the recognition that the Torah acknowledges our human frailty. We're made to mourn. We're made to miss the person who was in our lives for such a long time. And there's nothing to be ashamed of. And that we need to grieve properly and appropriately, and to go through all the difficult stages and allow it to flow, and not flagellate ourselves and say, I'm just being stupid, because doesn't the Torah tell us that the soul is in a much better place and it's in a higher level and it's been released from all of the limitations of this life and everything else? And you think to yourself, well, maybe I'm not being a good enough Jew, maybe I'm just not doing it the way the Torah tells me. Forget about all of that. It's nonsense. You just, in matters of bereavement, you have to go with the flow. You have to go with your heart. You have to allow it to happen, to move at its own pace. Yes, it is true, you can't get stuck. You have to move on. Judaism has this brilliant concept, of the stages of mourning, aninut, the first 3 days of Shiva, then the 7 days, Shloshim, 12 months, Yortzeit, everything else. All of that is great, and it really works. But you also have to go at your own pace as well. And I think that's the important lesson to take from tonight. And with that, I'm afraid, after this session, which is much longer than I thought it was going to be, I hand over to you for any questions you might like to ask before we close.
Shlomo, can I just ask a question, please?
Please.
Maybe at the end of session 6, if you could perhaps give us 5 minutes on how you think the grieving process is being affected by the COVID regulations at the moment, and the lack of the ability to have physical Shiva houses now, and whether that's going to be causing a lot of problems with people.
Well, I'm happy to deal with that right now, and I'll say to you the following. I think we've actually discovered some really important things during this lockdown, when funerals have been limited to immediate family. I think that a lot of the people who I've spoken to have said that they've actually rediscovered just how special a funeral can be, without all of the crowds and the numbers of people and the huge things and the everything. Just being able to be there with your immediate family, or just, being there quietly with the person who's died, has been actually very, very, very healing. So we've learned actually that it's not necessarily the case that big is beautiful. Of course, people want to give kavod and honor to the person who died, everything, etc. So that's one thing that we've learned. A second thing that we've learned is that actually our Zoom shivers, certainly the ones which, at a very early stage in running Zoom, from the very beginning, I decided to not do Mincha and Mariv and the whole business and have long rabbinic talks and everything else, because I just don't think that works on Zoom. So our Zoom shivers have moved very, very quickly, just after the Askara, the memorial prayer, to talking from the family and from people on Zoom, etc. And I've been really interested to hear, when you have people who are coming from all over the world, and piling in, people who could not possibly have been present at a Shiva. And actually I've heard from people who've been in, mourners have been in these Shiva prayers, that they've found them incredibly intimate. Would you believe it? Intimate. More intimate than even having it in their home. You go to somebody's house, it's always crowded. You're standing somewhere in the corridor, somewhere near the entrance or outside of the big bunch of people. There's this long line of people shuffling along to greet the mourner. They're sitting, there are so many people, they just can't process them all. A Zoom shiva, I don't think I ever want to stop doing them. Even when we get back to Shiva and people sitting in their homes and people visiting and davening mincha and everything else, I think there's always going to be a case for one night of Zoom Shiva. It really works. But on the other hand, the flip side is, from coronavirus, the question is going to be for those people, and there may well be people who are with us in this session tonight, who lost people who they loved in coronavirus, and they weren't able to be with them when they died, and they couldn't visit them in hospital. And I think that's a big, 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 big package to carry. I think that's a big burden. And reconciling to that and being able to live with that and to accept that and to make peace with God over that. We talk about God consoling. I think that's where it's going to really make a difference. But I think that the majority of our community, certainly I talk about our community, who have sat Shiva during this time, not necessarily because of coronavirus, but because of a loss of one form or another, will actually have come away from it feeling that it worked. They won't feel cheated. I think they'll feel that we found another way and the job has been done. That's my guess. I may be proven wrong, but yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi Shlomo. Could I ask you how often it's permissible to visit a grave?
The sages say excessive mourning is not advisable. There are people who need to be at a grave, every single week, etc. That's not a good idea. Because of this principle, Ruth, of moving on and etc. You can't get stuck. But other than that, there are no limitations upon how often you can visit a grave. You can visit a grave any time that you feel that you need to. If it's a place where and as we learned last week in last week's session, that when you're actually at the grave, you are connecting. It's a portal. It's the place where you connect with the soul of the person who's departed. And so it's an important place. And therefore it's entirely appropriate to visit a grave at any time that you really feel that you need to, provided that you're also aware of the fact that you're not getting stuck in the mourning process and unable to move on. And that's a balance which you have to feel for yourself. And if you don't feel it for yourself, if you're going too often, you can be sure that somebody who loves you is going to tell you you're going too often. Or at least they should.
Thank you. No, I don't think I'm in danger of doing that. It's just that I wasn't sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I just want to ask you a question to do with the Shiva, and it's to do with eating in the house where the Shiva is taking place. I was brought up to understand that you never ate as a guest, as a visitor in the house, sitting with people who were mourning. And I was quite surprised when I moved to London to find that after every service out came the tea and bridge rolls. Now, is that just a habit that people have got into? Is it permissible?
Strictly speaking, one should not serve food in a Shiva house. But I don't think you'll ever stop it, Marilyn.
Okay.
And I wouldn't try to.
No, it's a very nice social end to the evening. And as I've said on the 3 occasions I've unfortunately had to sit Shiva, it is such a wonderful distraction. This is away from Zoom. It was all before Zoom. It's one of the most wonderful things of the Jewish religion. Is the sitting Shiva and the people that come to visit. And I'm afraid it does sometimes seem like a bit of a party, but that's all part of it, all the reminiscences.
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
the odd jokes, the stories.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
it really.
Isn't it a funny thing about Shiva? And I'm sure that you'll agree with me that the first time I said Shiva, which was for our dad, I had always imagined it was going to be a really, really unremittingly sad occasion, and you were going to, you were going to do a lot of crying and everything else. I was surprised how much we laughed during the week of Shiva, and it wasn't disrespectful laughing. It was because you remembered all the funny things about the person who's passed away. We had siblings, reminisced and laughed. People came in and they told us, funny stories, and we laughed. And actually, when I look back on the two occasions when I've sat Shiva for my dad and more recently for my mum, I would say that in my life they are amongst the high spiritual moments of my life. I think I found the week of Shiva incredibly, incredibly spiritual. With its laughter, with its humanness, with its tears, with its siblings, brothers and sisters coming together and sharing memories and all the pain and everything else. But it's just an incredible, incredible invention.
But Shlomo, I had the same experience with my father to a point where we laughed so hard one night because he was a terribly funny man. And the story, we actually felt guilty, we were calling him out because that's the type of man my dad was. But when you talked before about people not trying to make light and tell jokes, I'm trying to connect that when you said it, because people did come, and people do come with light stories, and people do try and lighten the mood, and that takes us to another place, just like the food does, that ends the evening. So I don't know, it's a fine line. I know you're not meant to come in and make light, but just as you've repeated and I've said, people came with fabulous stories and brought a lightness, and they came with that in mind. I do believe they came.
Certainly, everybody comes to the Shiva with good intentions to try and console the person. Everybody tries in their own special way. But the focus, the main focus is to help to assist the mourner in processing. Because remember, Kriya is acceptance. Shiva is process. And whatever you do in the Shiva, it's part of helping the person to process the loss. Now, in a more slightly serious way, we've suggested that should be done by talking about the departed and etc., etc. And that's the best way to do it. But most people actually don't know how to do that very well. So instead, we resort to lightheartedness and to laughing and to jokes and things like that. It's not so much that it's a distraction; it is part of the process. It is, you go through all of that. But the better way to do it is the way in which we suggested this evening, is actually focusing, upon the person who's passed away and their special qualities, and engaging the mourner. Tell us about your mum, tell us about your dad, just explain to us what kind of person they were, get them talking about it, etc. That's the way to draw them in. That's the real process of actually transitioning from the physical to the spiritual relationship.
No, I understand, and just looking at Pamela, I totally understand. It was only in my context. It wasn't.
Yeah. That's right. Nobody is judging you. As we said, we have to start off.
I appreciate what you're saying.
Yeah, we have to start off with being non-judgmental. That's where we begin in all of this.
One of the things that actually is wonderful about the Shiva, I think, is that sometimes the people who come to the Shiva, like I said, if I come to a Shiva with people I don't know very well, by the end of the evening, you have such a respect for the person who's died. You find out all sorts of good things about somebody you knew so little about.
Yeah.
It can actually inspire when you've left there. There's somebody you hardly knew or knew only aspects of their life. You find out so many new things, and you realize people are so much better than you thought.
Yeah, and you're just sorry that you didn't know them better in their lifetime. Yeah.
Rabbi Shlomo, can I just say one thing that slightly bothers me, just about Zoom Shivas, and I can see the value, and definitely, because I think Judaism, it translates into, it's a bit like Shakespeare, it works wherever you do it, really, it just works. But The only thing is, it's kind of people are very alone, and they haven't got that physicality and the community around them. And that,
Well, that's what I'm saying. Actually,
I worry about them.
that's why I say that well, yes, as somebody who's sitting entirely alone, it's very hard. But very often people are sitting with, with families or with someone. But even so, the people who have been alone have told me that they've actually have felt very not alone. They've actually felt, although there hasn't been, you can never compensate for physical presence. I mean, that is true. We all know that somewhere, we can't continue to live in this state. We need to have physical contact with people, see them face to face, smell them. As I read in the Times this morning from somebody who said that she lost the sense of smell with corona, and she's so pleased that now she's looking forward to the time when she can smell somebody's armpit, she said. It's a bit bizarre. But nevertheless, even people who have been on their own have said that they have actually felt, seeing all this, you see them on the screen, they're all there, they're right in front of you, you can see everybody. You can flick backwards and forwards between the 25 screens of 3,426 people who have come to your shiva. It's really amazing. But not the total. I'm not suggesting it's an either or. I'm saying that we'll get to a point where it's going to be a both and, not an either or. Yeah.
And you get a recording.
And you get a recording as well. Yes. Yeah. Tonight's recording, by the way, will probably be up on our website by Thursday night or Friday morning, if anybody wants to go back over any of it. I did have to skip out some sections tonight, and I've skipped the video and stuff. You won't see that. Actually, you might. No, you won't see it on the recording either, I'm afraid. But until next week, thank you for hanging in. I'm very impressed that you've stayed with us for 3 weeks. I mean, it's amazing. I thought the numbers were all going to drop off dramatically, but you've just hung in. Maybe you've got nothing else. Maybe maybe you have nothing else to do on a Wednesday night. I don't know.
That's right.
Thanks.
Just seeing Rabbi Shlomo, every week. It's a wonderful thing.
All right. Look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have a good week, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Yeah.
The funny thing is that it's made me look at myself, and it's made me look at other people and try to sort of see their soul, not as just the person, but it's instead of saying you're a beautiful person, you can look at them and go, you're a beautiful soul. Because after having our lessons, I don't know why, I just feel I look at things a little bit differently. And you said that it was the journey of the soul, it wasn't about death. And I think it's so right. I think even learning about how to deal with death, it empowers you, because it's also allows you to help other people who are dealing with all of this.
Yeah, and you see, the point is, bodies divide, souls unite.
Mm-hmm.
The divisions in the world are between bodies. When you see the soul of another person, you realize that actually we are the same. Yeah.
Well, it's quite a revelation, and so thank you. Because even though I might have known it inherently, it's to be more aware of it is just actually quite life-changing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, all.
Good night.
Good night.